So in recent weeks, I've had a lot of people reach out with concerns and questions over Bill 67, the Racial Equity in the Education System Act. Race and racial reconciliation have been a leading issue in North America in recent months and years. Numerous incidents have pushed this conversation forward. Things like Black Lives Matter protests, the unmarked graves that were discovered at our Canadian residential schools. So we're seeing a real and important conversations grappling with the atrocities of history and seeing how they impact our present reality, including the reality that prejudice and racism still exist today. Back on December 2nd in 2021, NDP MPP Laura May Lindo, she introduced Bill 67, the Racial Equity in the Education System Act, and it overwhelmingly passed second reading on March 3rd, 2022. With all three main political parties supporting this bill and only New Blue MPP Belinda Carajalios voting against it. So what is this bill all about? So Bill 67 proposes changes to a number of different Ontario acts with the goal of rooting out racism in Ontario's education system. So here's some specifics that Bill 67 is looking to change. Minister of Education would be required to develop an anti-racism accountability report to ensure that new teachers are properly trained in anti-racism and racial equity. They would also provide a mechanism to fine somebody up to $200 for interrupting proceedings, either in schools or classes, using racist language or activities. They would add performance appraisals for teachers related to anti-racism awareness and their efforts to promote racial equity. The Minister of Education would be required to establish policies and guidelines that promote racial equity in schools. School boards and principals would be required to establish and implement racial equity plans and post them on their websites. Accredited Ontario College of Teachers would be required to complete training and examinations in anti-racism. And all colleges and universities that receive Ontario government funding would be required to create anti-racism and racial equity policies. Now, at face value, many of these things seem like no big deal. Something like we Christians could easily get behind. But an underlying problem lurks in the definition of terms. There are two definitions that are cause for confusion and concern. Anti-racism is the first one. It's used 58 times in the legislation, and equity used 54 times. Now, when we understand what these terms mean when used by those who ascribe to what is more broadly known as critical race theory, we begin to understand why so many are rightly concerned about Bill 67. So first of all, let's look at the term equity. The term equity is really easily confused with equality. Now, the Christian worldview supports equality in that we recognize that all men and women are created in the image of God, Genesis 1, verse 27, and they all hold equal value and dignity. Each individual is to be treated equally before the law, regardless of color, creed, or sex. But for critical race theorists, equality is not the same as equity, and it makes a big difference in the context of Bill 67. In a recent podcast, Jordan Peterson explained the difference between equity and equality, and here's the quote. Equity is predicated on the idea that if there is any difference in outcome between any group imaginable, so those groups that could be defined by gender, race, sex, if there's any difference in outcome of any sort, that is not only an indication of profound and systemic bias characterizing whatever domain is being questioned, but it is incumbent upon all members of that domain to regard themselves as prejudiced and biased and to view non-equal outcomes as systemic bias. End quote. Barbara Kay recently wrote a Western Standard article, and she says this, and I quote, "Equity and equality sound very similar, but they are worlds apart. Equality is about starting lines for individuals offered the same opportunities to exercise their talents and ambitions, but doesn't guarantee equal success for everyone. Equity is about finding finishing lines for groups. If minority groups don't achieve the same outcomes in proportion to their numbers in the population, there can only be one reason: racism, or some other form of bigotry exercised by an oppressor group with privilege." When we read the term equity in Bill 67, it's crucial to remember that equity is not referring to making sure that there is a level playing field for all Ontarians. Instead, it's striving to make sure outcomes are the same for all, even if that means holding some people back. We're expected to accept that if the outcome is not the same, It's because of the effects of racial bias or prejudice and no other factors. And if you don't agree that bias and prejudice is to blame for the struggles of some, that in and of itself is evidence that proves your bias or prejudice. This ignores the actual overwhelming obstacles that some students face in their ability to thrive. Bill 67 would allow this thinking to become a building block of Ontario's education system. So what does this mean for Ontario's education system? The Ministry of Education, school boards, and teachers, they would be tasked with ensuring that outcomes for all students are the same, regardless of merit. And if racial minorities don't achieve at the same levels as their counterparts, they're told two things. First, the color of their skin is what's holding them back. And second, they cannot achieve the same level of success without someone else, usually some privileged white bureaucrat, intervening on their behalf. And this is incredibly condescending and has racist undertones of its own. Now, the second word that needs clarification is anti-racism. Merriam-Webster defines anti as one that is opposed. And who would say that they're not opposed to racism? Again, all men and women ought to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race. James 2 verse 1 reminds us to show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, end quote. How could we not be in favor of policies that call for help bringing about an end to racial discrimination in Ontario schools? We should be in favor of such policies. Fortunately, this isn't what's meant by the term anti-racism as found in Bill 67. In an effort at clarity, the bill includes an explanation. And here it says, anti-racism means the policy of opposing racism, including anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. You'll notice a clear omission of the Caucasian race here. In the eyes of critical race theorists, one cannot be racist towards white people. Best-selling author and critical race theorist Robin DiAngelo, she writes in her best-selling book, White Fragility, a positive white identity is an impossible goal. White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy, end quote. In a similar vein, activist Ibram Kendi, he writes in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist, and here I quote, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. And the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Now, noted Christian author and expert on critical race theory, Samuel Say, he responds to this thinking by saying, and here I quote from a recent blog, God doesn't instruct us to repay evil for evil or racism for racism. God doesn't instruct Black people to assume the worst of white people because some white people assume the worst of Black people. God commands Black people, like Samuel Say, to assume the best of white people, even if some white people assume the worst of Black people, like Samuel Say. Racism is a vicious cycle that would be stopped if we refuse to repay evil for evil, racism for racism, end quote. In that same blog post, Say points us to 1 Peter 3 verses 8 and 9. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for to this you are called, that you may obtain a blessing. ARPA Canada has long advocated for Christian anti-bullying policies to refuse to include long lists of aggrieved identity groups. The Bible admonishes against the focus on people's diverse personal characteristics. See Galatians 3 verse 28, Colossians 3 verse 11. We believe that including specific references to personal characteristics does not foster unity or equality and is in fact detrimental to the goal of equality. We believe that God's commands to love our neighbor and to practice patience, kindness towards all people apply to all people at all times. Bullying is wrong and racism is wrong, period. Critical race theorists, along with most progressive thinkers of our day, get identity wrong. Barbara Kay explains in her recent Western Standard article, critical race theory does not care about your child's individual character. Critical race theory teaches that we should judge ourselves and others only by skin color, gender identity, DNA. So think of things like indigenous status and other group markers. In a book review of D'Angelo's White Fragility, Samuel Say sums up anti-racism this way. Anti-racism is just pro-racism appearing as an angel of light. Anti-racism is an antichrist ideology that uses racism as a means to fight supposed racism. It's an ideology that labels good as evil and evil as good, and it's in direct opposition to Christianity. Anti-racists and white supremacists agree that a person's skin color is the most significant thing about them. They agree that a person's skin color shapes who they are. As Christians, we know that who we are is based on who our Creator is, and who, for the Christian, who our Savior is. God created humanity good and in His image, Genesis 1 verses 26 and 27, with the ability and responsibility to care for and rule over creation, verse 28. Our first parents rebelled against God, Genesis 3. They corrupted our whole nature, Ephesians 2 verse 3. Depravity is total. It touches all parts of our lives, including our bodies, intellect, and will. Depravity is why we have the evil that is racism in our world, and no human effort, including political efforts, can eradicate evil. Yet, even after the fall into sin, a remnant of God's image still exists in all humanity. Although it's greatly obscured by sin, also the terrible sin of racism, and it's still used and is used to serve the creature rather than the Creator, this image of God still exists. As such, humanity possesses an inherent and inalienable dignity and worth which separates us from all other creatures. And this dignity is given to all humans regardless of age, ability, sex, race, or any other characteristic. This inherent dignity must be honored by all. Pray that it is, and that the church may be able to share this liberating perspective in the spirit of true reconciliation. And North America's history includes awful, racially motivated crimes that must be recognized. But responding to our history and ongoing discrimination or racism with more discrimination and racism is the exact opposite of the reconciliation that's needed. Codifying forms of prejudice in Ontario's education system will not unify us. But what about Bill 67? Well, this bill is quite concerning because it looks to infuse a terribly divisive ideology into Ontario's education system. It's important to understand that Bill 67 is not likely to pass third reading in Ontario's legislature, which means it's not likely to become law in Ontario at this time. There is simply not enough time before the election for this bill to be studied at the Standing Committee for Social Policy and then be returned to the legislature for third reading. Having said that, even if this bill is not passed, it's important to understand that this thinking is already prevalent in much of our society. And to that end, we ought to be prepared for more legislation like this in the future. So reaching out to your MPP and letting them know your concerns about this bill and and this type of thinking, that would be a really good idea. And then as for the Ontario election, as it approaches, I encourage you to keep this in mind as you ask questions of those candidates that are seeking your vote and keeping this conversation moving forward. Thank you.